Yeah. I just wanted to, first of all, I'm sure we did an acknowledgement of country today, but I'm going to do it again and highlight that essentially we're meeting on the lands of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and the Palua people, Pakani people across Tasmania, and they have an incredible wealth of knowledge and connection to land, water and skies, and we could learn a lot from that, so it's worth celebrating and acknowledging that. I'm here today to talk about TasNetworks and the role that we play in this clean energy transition. I just wanted to start by saying 20 years ago I started in this field, and it's been amazing, the difference, and I'm particularly pleased to be here today because there was a handful of people in Tasmania involved in this in early 2008, and now there's close to 1,000 people involved in this, and it's just going to get better and better in terms of an expansion of the industry. So it's an exciting time, and I encourage anyone who's considering being involved in this field to come and see us at TasNetworks in terms of career opportunities. And that's mainly because we have a lot going on. We're at the heart of the transition, the clean energy future transition. It's how we describe ourselves in our climate change statement. That's because essentially we're the conduit. We're in between renewable energy expansion and meeting the demands of things like EV, hydrogen, community battery demand. We've got remote area power supply, small scale rooftop PV. There's a lot of things going on. So we're trying to balance and play this role in between. We also support Australian government targets. So the Tasmanian government has set a target to double renewables. So we're close to 98% renewable energy in our electricity grid. We're looking to double that by 2040 and get 50% of the way there in the next 5 years. So it's a huge undertaking. I think that's something that we perhaps don't have our head around in terms of the huge scale of challenges that we have ahead of us. And essentially we need people's help. We need everyone's help to problem solve and make sure that this transition goes as best as it can be. I'm going to flick to the next thing if I can find that. There it is. Yeah. So the main thing that we do is we provide electricity through poles and wires, but it's a kind of bigger role in Tasmania because we're a government entity, and so we're essentially accountable to the people. We're there to provide the services that people want, and that's a particularly tricky thing with the challenges ahead. So those needs are evolving all the time. We are involved in the Northwest transmission development, so the new transmission lines to meet Marinus Link to export our energy into the eastern seaboard. This is a huge project. It requires a lot of community consultation, and we've been going to talk to those communities. So keep checking our website if you want to have your voice heard in regard to that. I suppose one of the things I'm going to mention in regard to that is that the demand for electricity is expected to grow by 60%. That's a huge challenge. I think I've been over it, but essentially that's what the Northwest transmission developments are trying to do. They're trying to facilitate an expansion of the grid that's almost half the size of our current grid, and we're going to have to try and meet that in smarter ways to minimise costs. So this is one of the most exciting things happening on the horizon in Tasmania. I wanted to say that we've been involved in this since 2016, TasNetworks. We've really expanded our programs. We've got a number of different things that we do. We have the Bright Sparks and STEAM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts and Mathematics program where we go into schools, so we reach about 10,000 students a year. We have a corporate social responsibility strategy. We have just a bunch of different things that are trying to get the best possible outcomes, environmental, social, economic outcomes for Tasmania. We report emissions every year, so we're part of the Australian government new reporting regime, which includes outlining our risks and climate risks and opportunities into the future. This is a really kind of exciting time, I think, for us to be able to kind of articulate to the public what we're doing in this space. I wanted to come back to this point that in 2016 we bought the first Nissan Leaf that we had for our company. It was a big deal. There was a big report on it I found on our system. We're now up to 17 full electric vehicles and hybrids. So we have 14 full electric and 3 hybrids. When they bought the Nissan Leaf, at that time there was a whole bunch of press release and background briefing and justification, that this was such a new thing, this is an unfolding thing, and that's only 8 years ago. So I think there's this real sense in this field that things are so rapidly changing. It's amazing and it's exciting. We have 52 chargers now across Tasmania, so one of the biggest charger network. We've been involved in another amazing story is street lighting. So about 15 years ago, I was involved in street lighting in Tasmania with local governments, and there was no options for LED lighting back then. They were looking at the first possible projects. Now 3/4 of street lighting have switched to LED. So it's this huge change that's happening. And it's really fantastic to be part of this evolution. We have a bunch of other things going on, and you're welcome to come and talk to me about it at the TasNetworks stall. I won't go into too much detail, but I'm one of 9 sustainability officers at TasNetworks, and they each do different things. So my main role is in climate change, responding to the impacts of climate change and reducing emissions, but we have waste officers, we have threatened bird species protection programs and officers associated with that. We have reducing waste to landfill, which is really important, reducing the impact of any spills, particularly around waterway management, and then planning going forward, how we can minimise our impact from this expansion of the network. We also, I think anyone who's been in Tasmania for the last bit has noticed the storm events that we had in September, but that was some of the worst storm events where we had half the population of Tasmania without power in total at some points. That cost an estimated 11.5 million. And so under the climate change scenarios where we're getting more extreme events and more frequent events, you're looking at this kind of cost in a more frequent manner, which is a really difficult challenge. And so the kinds of things that we're looking at are how do you essentially, an example is bushfire being one of our biggest threats. How do you paint our bushfire poles to reduce the likelihood that those poles are going to catch alight? How do you design in certain areas like Mount Wellington with high bushfire risk to put those that infrastructure underground? So we're looking at all of those things as part of a plan that we have to manage the physical risks of climate change, which will become more and more dominant. I think I've already talked about this, but it's really hard to get your head around the kind of scale of change that we're looking at. So you've got essentially the Australian Energy Market Operator has got these scenarios that they've put out where we're looking to essentially double electricity demand, which is a huge challenge by 2050, a 6-fold increase in wind and solar by 2050, by grid scale wind and solar. In Tasmania, we're looking to kind of triple the amount of wind capacity that we have at the moment in the next 5 years in order to just meet the interim Tasmanian renewable energy target I was talking about. So that kind of the scale it's a challenge that's unprecedented over the last 2 decades. And these are all kind of things that are happening in the background. We've got the Australian government has now set requirements that the electricity industry has to provide safe, reliable power and reduce emissions, and they've written that into law as well. So they're all really important factors driving change. I've just got this thing that goes over the types of things that we do, but we're a big asset manager in Tasmania mainly. This is the point of this slide. We have a lot of assets to manage. So when it comes to storms, high wind events, even just the logistics of 50,000 streetlights and managing them and switching them over. We also are a telecommunications provider, so that's something that most people aren't aware of, that we provide some of the core infrastructure to allow smart technology. These are I suppose the types of things I've been talking about, that in the past we had a BAU, the business as usual model was just providing electricity, and now we've got all these fabulous challenges coming up on the horizon, community batteries being one of them. How do we integrate them into the network to get the best possible outcomes for everybody? Our emissions footprint comes from the electricity line losses mainly. So we have a footprint that we report every year. We have a responsibility to try and reduce our own emissions as well as everybody else. The types of emissions that we have is mainly from the losses. So as electricity is pushed along the electricity lines, you lose around 6% of that energy. In places like Tasmania, we have a low emissions footprint because of the renewables, but we also import a lot of electricity from the mainland, and that has things like coal and gas. So we have a footprint that comes in because of that. We also use localised gas generation, gas power generation, Bell Bay. So that's where our emissions footprint comes from in our electricity mix. I think one of the projects that's already been raised is that we've been actively involved in research and development and trialling some of these things. So the Consort Bruny Island project was a particularly interesting one, and one that had some firsts, so world first in terms of trying to use independent battery systems in a fringe of grid location, and those battery systems were able to export power at different times of use depending on when they get the best profit, essentially. The kind of challenge that was set out was Bruny Island had a huge amount of has peak times like Easter and Christmas, and they were getting to stages where the grid wasn't able to provide power for those times. So we were looking at installing an additional cable or trialling something like this where they had 34 households with these solar battery arrangements. Really great results from the project, really great research. So we had universities like Sydney and University of Tasmania. They were looking at the consumer side of things, but they found from all of the monitoring that without a battery, the consumption was about 41%, and then with a battery they were able to kind of use more of their own power and therefore draw less from the grid. So it's well understood and well accepted that the annual solar savings are about $750 to $800 a year in Tassie. The savings with a battery were about $1,100. So there's some really positive outcomes from that project. The other project I was going to mention that is of late is the 2 community batteries that are planned for Howrah and Burnie. So they're 118 kilowatt, 257 kilowatt hour kind of export ability. The idea of them is mainly to be able to hold, at its core, hold power and be able to sell it and use it at a time where it has the most benefits. So we're at the very early stages of installing that, and we hope to keep briefing the community on that one. The other kinds of projects I just wanted to mention briefly, and this is the last slide, is that we have a number of fabulous community development programs. So we have over 100,000 that we give out in grants to 16 different successful groups this year. And those groups have done things like go and talk to, during Senior Citizens Week, they've gone to talk to community groups about the top 10 things they can do in their home to reduce energy use. We've got a booklet that's been developed. It's available at our stand, so an energy efficiency booklet that covers the same kind of things. And then this fabulous People Power project, which developed out of that, which was like basically train the trainer. So now you've got things like men's sheds. They're going to then teach other leaders in their community about this. So there's heaps of positive things. Come and talk to me more if you want to. I'm happy to go over anything. To kind of recap, I think these things have been over already, different types of programs. We have a lot of different things going on, and we're going to be at the centre of this. So if you have something, good idea or whatever you want to talk to us about, please come and see me. It's a really exciting time to be involved. I'm glad to be here today, and I'm glad to celebrate that we're at this stage in the industry. It's really fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for your time today. Yeah, do you have any questions? Yeah.
Thanks. I'm sorry I missed a fair bit of what you said. But as somebody that's tried to put in their own solar support system, one of the things I found is actually Tas Networks have put in a prohibitive cost for me to actually install. The cost for me to connect onto the network at the level that they want is the equivalent of me putting in the whole solar system. The reality is I'm currently got a solar system. Mm-hmm. I currently do contribute. I was looking to extend what I can contribute into the network.
Yes, yeah.
We get bugger all in terms of what we are charged and what we get paid for our electricity units. And what I'm looking at is actually there's a disincentive for individuals by Tas Networks' costing approach to what for us to actually install. And I think one of the strengths of a network could well be having distributed sources of power as opposed to just putting it back into the hands of a few corporates.
Yeah.
Because as homeowners, we're looking to take advantage. So you've got these education systems, but right now Tas Networks has a policy of charging excessive fees and not warranted in terms of the feedback of power we would like to put in.
I think there was a couple of questions in there, but thank you for your question. There's, I think, a couple of things we can talk about, the more the details of your project, because it's very specific for each location. Are you talking about the 10 kilowatt cap mainly? Yes. That's something that we're looking into. We're looking into the standard things that were put in place to try and improve safety and ensure reliability, and whether or not there's any room to move some of the boundaries on that. So that's one thing. I think two would make the point that we are supportive of solar connections generally. So there's over 45,000 households and businesses that have connected in Tasmania, and we have over 3,000 that connect every year. And we had the most this year than we've ever had before. So it's not something that's been inhibited. But we do have these other things in place that we're looking to. Could we allow the expansion even further? So that's definitely something that's on our horizon to look at. When it comes to the tariff structure, that's something that's a little more complicated, that Tas Networks is generally responsible for a portion of the bill, but not necessarily in setting particularly the solar tariffs. So I mean, I think that's a different topic unto itself. There's been a lot of community consultation on those tariffs and whether or not they're reasonable. That's something that's open to comment, I think. Overall, though, I think it's worth noting that on average, if you still connect around an 8 kilowatt, 10 kilowatt system, you're looking like you're still going to pay it off within 6 to 7 years. And I'm happy to show the maths on that. That's a really, that's where the $750 figure comes from our case study, but I've done it for family and friends and for members of the public, around $800 a year in savings that will pay off around an $8,000 system. So the economics is still really reasonable. I think you're probably talking about a location, it's worth going into, but fringe of grid is trickier in some places. Rapid expansion of solar is trickier. There's definitely the more remote area power supply challenges, like the connection to the grid cost can be very expensive. So you're not doing remote area power supply because the economics is very favourable in that case. So yeah, I think it's a really hard one to answer, but I think I'm happy to talk about it with you more. Yeah. Is there any more questions? That's about it. Otherwise, I'll follow up with you.
Alison, it's almost like a fireside chat with people. Because you work for Tas Networks and Hydro standing here, what do you think the next 5 years looks like for those of us who have connected or are planning to connect?
Particularly with solar or with EV there's a lot of different connections. The next 5 years is going to be an exciting time. I think there's going to be rapid expansion, particularly with EV owners. That's a really fascinating market in the next 5 years. There'll be a huge expansion in overnight charging. We've already seen some of the statistics from Clive, that I think it's over 95% of people charge from home. So therefore all of that energy that was being used in the transport sector is now coming online. So that's one aspect of that. We're definitely working on the bigger picture of the large-scale renewable energy challenge, being where hydro comes in, and others, in terms of connecting to the grid. We actually have to come up with a plan for the next 10 years, and every year we report on that, called our annual performance review, so that's available on the website. But we actually have to have more detail than we've ever had before, and we're required to do that from the Australian government under this new climate reporting. So to be honest, all of that work is happening right now behind the scenes. So for the next 5 years, we're going to have a clear vision. In the next 10 years, for the next 30 years, short, medium and long term, it's going to have to be much more clearly articulated. So we already have some information on our website. You can go and have a look at that. But it requires a lot of detailed modelling to work out exactly when things are going to come in and the price and what role we'll have as well. Yeah.
Certainly the last time we had TES Networks at the AEVA conference was 2017. You've come a long way. And, to the young man's point about centralised generation being broadcast out to a network, it's the speaker then said that's not how it's going to be. It'll be 1,000, what did you say, 60,000 Tasmanian hams?
45,000, yeah. And it's over 3 million, I think, across Australia. And there's times like in the last year, in the first quarter of the last year, small-scale rooftop solar overtook grid-scale wind, solar and gas in its contribution to the NEM at that time, which is actually unheard of or unprecedented in terms of what people thought would happen with the small-scale sector. So it's just amazing what's possible. And in terms of your question about decentralised versus centralised, that's, again, a very complex issue. I mean, we've got factors moving away, like small-scale battery, even to some extent, community batteries, they can help with satellite power provision. But at the same time, you've got all of these EVs coming online with much more greater demand, and they're going to need grid support to do that. So the role of the grid will still be central in the future. And then it's just working out an appropriate pricing structure that doesn't disadvantage people who are doing their own essential home grid management or, on-site power supply. Yeah.
In last year, we had Damon Gameau, the producer, and he told us all about his project called 2040. And he used a couple of examples of, one was in India, 6 million people had joined a community grid.
Wow.
And everybody's power systems, a very clever Indian person had invented the switch, the tracking and the monitoring, and they would settle up at the end of the month in cash with each other. But it meant that if you could only face 3 panels north and your friend wanted to watch the big screen with the World Cup, all of the power went there, and then it went there, and then it went there. And that was 2 years ago, so I reckon that if they had 6 million. So one day I wonder if the community battery that you're talking about will scale to that level, where every suburb, not just Howrah and Bruny, would have them. Do you see that day?
Yeah, it's in the very initial stages of that market development. It's going to be that's a really fascinating one, community batteries, because there's a number of different types of uses. So one of the examples is you have a small country town and it gets cut off by bushfire. You could potentially have the community battery powering the town hall in emergencies. So it's got an emergency resilience function, and then you've got its ability to provide EV users with power, so they're then even more resilient, can actually transport themselves, travel in an emergency. So there's that. There's supporting the adoption of solar in areas where it's heavily saturated and the grid is struggling to meet all of their variable power supply. And then you've got an ability to use the community battery to make money, to buy and sell electricity at different times. So I can definitely see that time that you're talking about, but it's very early stages. It's an experimental stage in terms of research and development. It's in that research and development. I mean, these are the first community batteries we've ever had in Tasmania. There's definitely some in the community that have been trialled, but relatively recently. And yeah, I mean, we've got a huge challenge coming up when it comes to energy storage. We're going to need all kinds of different energy storage options. in the future. Yeah. Thank you, John.
Did you ever meet Mr. Tomlin up in Ellendale, who
No.
diverted the Derwent River through a turbine and now sells electricity to his neighbours?
Oh, wow.
He's done it twice. I'm just thinking you're the man next, sir. You too? You know about him? You met him, yeah. So, not that I want to be a counter-revolutionary, but TasNetworks and Hydro and Aurora would welcome people taking the pressure off the grid. And if you're ever wondering how we're going, the Renew Economy magazine is listing off all of the batteries coming online. You can't keep up with the news from around Australia. There's got to be a dollar in it, of course. But poor old, the existing old model of electricity generation is, we hope that it keeps raining, don't we?
Yeah, well, I mean, I still think there's a big role for just the sheer scale of industrial power use. It's it's more than half of Tasmania's electricity use. So how to come up with a way of providing industrial electricity off-grid is a huge challenge. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's potentially possible. It's an interesting future.
You and I laughed before about double glazing, but if every house in Tasmania was retrofitted with double glazing, because I think less than 10% of houses are, it would save 8% of energy. Give it to Bell Bay, give it to to the other companies that are using it. Grid scale, renewable, that's a long way off, isn't it?
Well, energy conservation, energy efficiency is really important. It will always be an important role, And there's lots of, I'm sure you've come across it, there's positive and negative feedback mechanisms. So when you do get solar, people sometimes consume more because they think it doesn't matter. So there's a lot of education awareness. Having people kind of perform the best that they can is always going to be on the agenda, I think, and that's something we've partnered with Hydro and Aurora on trying to increase people's awareness, because it's a huge journey, I think, still to go along.
Yes, education. Once a mind has been stretched, it can't return to the original condition. And it's not something that we talk about and or learn about in school. So I think TasNetworks are lucky to have 19 Alisons out there sharing the message and spreading the good vibe. Well
I think I mentioned we go for Bright Sparks. We go to school, so we see 10,000 students a year, and we now talk about that.
STEAM.
Yes.
I thought it was STEM. You've added the A.
That's right. That's for arts. To add arts to STEM.
Why was that? Why did you add arts?
I think that they were not acknowledging the creative and innovative element that's involved in that. So you've got the science, like disciplines that are very strict with, convention and established practice. And then now with the arts, you've got an innovation element, which is very important.
Sure is. Well done. Everyone happy? No more questions? Thank you, Alison,
Thank
for making
you.
yourself
Cheers.
available. You're living proof that TasNetworks is doing what it has to do.
I appreciate that, John.
My pleasure.
Cheers.